Hi, I'm CJ and this is Music Monday. So this week we're going to talk about musical history. I do need to explain a little bit about what happened last week. I got a little overwhelmed. I'm not going to lie. I got a little overwhelmed with the sheer amount of history that's out there in terms of what music has done over the existence of humanity. And instead of taking a small portion of it at a time, I decided to do the whole thing, which was a little crazy, but here we go. So I struggled last week. I had a little bit of a difficulty determining where I wanted to stop. I was initially going to do my first video on prehistoric music, ancient music, and medieval music, but it turns out that there is so much to talk about that didn't happen. So we're going to start this week by talking only about prehistory. So in the interest of keeping my sanity, I've decided to divide music up into 6 categories. Prehistory, which is before 1400 BCE, ancient history, which is 1400 BCE to 500 CE, medieval history, which is 500 CE to 1500 CE, modern history, which is 1500 to 1900 CE. Modern history. And then 20th century history, which is 1900 to 2000 CE. And then if we have time and I feel so inclined, we will talk about the 21st century and the future of music, which is 2000 to the present day. So I'm going to divide these up into 6 weeks of videos. So we will be talking about, today we'll be talking about prehistoric music. This is a pretty short video because what we know about prehistoric music is pretty limited. Predominantly it is supplied by archaeology. So the reason it's called prehistoric is that there's no real writing describing it, which makes it not history. It makes it prehistory. Next week we will talk about ancient history. And then each week after that we'll take one of these other topics, other periods, and talk about it then. So that being said, let's talk about prehistoric music. So talking about prehistory, one of the struggles of talking about music in prehistory is that we don't have any written record. Prehistory actually spans from more or less the dawn of human existence, all the way through about 1400 BCE. So the first thing I want to talk about is the dating system. Not dating as in will you go out with me, but dating as in historical dates. So some people use, and in the past, historians have used BC and AD as the two sides of dating. BC means before Christ. AD is often referred to as, I hear a lot of people say, oh, that means after death. So that BC means before Christ was born, AD means after his death. The problem with that interpretation is that, well, it's wrong. But there's like 33 years in there that get lost. They're just the nothing years, I guess. My guess is that most people who say that have never really thought deeply about it. So this is a chance to learn something new. AD actually means Anno Domini. It stands for a Latin phrase, Anno Domini, which means in the year of our Lord. And it was first used, I believe, in the late medieval period. And it's when what we consider modern dating first became a thing. Prior to that, dates were kept according to things like in the 3rd year of the reign of Cyrus the Great. So whatever reigning monarch, whatever year it was. So in the 1st year that Pharaoh Ramses was on the throne, this happened. Or in the 16th year of the reign of Ashurbanipal, this happened. And that was a pretty common way to gauge time. Because the world has gotten smaller and at the same rate it's gotten bigger, we see more globally now, those kind of dating mechanisms don't work quite as well. So in the global society, with a few notable exceptions, historians date using what we call BCE, which means before the Common Era, and CE, which means Common Era. So before the Common Era is 1 BC all the way back to about 1400 BC, which is the beginning, more or less, the beginning of history. So I hear you say, why do we call it prehistory? The reason it's called prehistory is that history is defined by written record. If we don't have a written record of it, it's not history, it's archaeology. And archaeology has a wonderful place in history, but it supports rather than defines history. So one of the reasons that I've been struggling with this particular topic in music is because history doesn't happen in a vacuum. It doesn't, when we talk about the history of music, it's very difficult to just extract that from the wider swaths of history and say, oh, well, this is the history of music, and we can follow it from point A to point B to C to D and so on, all the way to the present day. Unfortunately, it doesn't work like that. And you can actually tell this even more definitively by looking at the dates that I've set out here. These are really broad dates. So prehistory is defined as anything before the written word. What do we call the written word? Do we start with pictograms? Do we start with actual language? Where do we start with the written word? And the reason I started with 1400 BCE is because that is actually the date of the oldest known song that we have a record of. So in terms of prehistory, that's where we start. So music in prehistory is a really fascinating place. First of all, there are no certainties as far as what came first or how things developed. What we do know is this: music began to happen in the human race. Humans began to make music at some point. There is some speculation as to what came first, whether it was musical instruments that you could bang on, or clapping, or patting, the rhythm, or if it was the tonal portion. So la 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 la. While there's debate about when exactly music started to become part of the human culture, there's some pretty solid evidence when studying untouched cultures in the modern world that the oldest known forms, or most likely the oldest forms of music, were made by voice, and probably began to develop around the same time that humans began to develop speech. We began to develop language, and that sound, the experience of creating sound with our voices, led to the creation of music. That's the theory anyway. So there's a couple of different theories on how that happened. One is that it was a community building thing. You sit around the fire at night and you may be speaking, or you may be singing. Somebody may sing a melody and someone else may join in. Singing together, we know this for a fact, psychologically, singing together creates community. One of the other possibilities is that it could have evolved from what's called motherese, which is how adults talk to children, and particularly to infants, which creates a bond there. Again, it's a community builder, but it's creating a bond between the mother and the child, or between the parent and the child, the caregiver and the child. It doesn't necessarily have coherent words to go with it. And so often it's tone and nonsense. It teaches children how to talk and how to interact with other people based on tone. So if the voice is the first musical instrument, what comes next? Well, it's most likely that what came next, if it wasn't a matter of rhythm coming first in terms of clapping or tapping or playing rhythms on other things, it was most likely very close to that same time period. People would use rocks, wood, bone, whatever they had, sometimes leather stretched out over a framework, although that seems to have come later. There's a lot of archaeological finds out there that produce what we believe to be flutes. And flutes seem to be one of the earliest, flutes or pipes tend to be what we see as the earliest created instruments. In 2008, archaeologists found what was what they believed to be a pipe or a flute made out of a vulture's wing bone. They dated it to about 35,000 years ago. And generally, it was very similar to what we see in music stores when you get a recorder. It has a V-shaped mouthpiece. It has 5 holes on the length of it, and it can create different tones. For those of you who are interested in additional information about prehistoric music, I'm going to put several links below. There's a couple of links to the British Museum talking about some of the finds that have occurred in Ireland. There are pipes and flutes that have been found in Ireland that are prehistoric. The one that was found in 2008 was found in Germany, so I'll put a link to that as well. Now, when we get to the end of prehistory, right about the time that ancient history begins, we know that music has become part of the community in a way that it wasn't in the beginning. Now, we can't trace that exactly, but we do know that music developed a religious component. And what you'll see over the course of the next several weeks is a continuation of that theme. Music as an aspect of religious expression, as an aspect of religious worship, whether it's in a group or whether it's for individuals. Music plays a huge role in religious expression. This can be through vocalization, using pitch, using timbre, or using rhythm. It can also be using instruments. The earliest instruments were probably drums, made out of stone, just using rocks that you pick up. You can make different sounds depending on where your hand hits or depending on what you hit it with. Maybe pieces of wood, which, you know, are a little bit softer, don't hurt as much when you hit them. And then you have flutes made out of bone, maybe made out of wood. The next stage of instruments that come are stringed instruments. Usually people think of stringed instruments, they think of violins or guitars or maybe even a ukulele, which is my example today. But these would have been probably smaller. And instead of being strung with metal strings like a harp is, or a lot of the stringed instruments, including acoustic pianos, by the way, are strung with metal strings. These strings probably would have been organic. They may have been made out of some kind of fabric, or a piece of what we would think of as string, made out of some kind of organic matter. But there's also the possibility that they were made out of the intestines or strips of intestine of animals. Using intestines to string instruments actually has a long, long history, all the way up until the early modern era. Many instruments were strung with some kind of intestine. Shakespeare actually talks about, he references it in Much Ado About Nothing, where one of the characters says, "Is it not strange that sheep's guts should hale men's souls from their bodies?" And I think I've mentioned that before. That's one of my favorite Shakespearean quotes. But the idea that sheep's intestines were used to string instruments. So the reason that you would use something like an intestine is because it's got a little bit of give. Obviously, these are not intestinal strings. I promise, not intestinal. These are plastic and much more harmful to the environment. They share some similar traits to that kind of thing. So one of the things that you need in a string is the ability to string it fairly tight. I don't know how well you can see this, but this string doesn't move a whole lot. You can move it a little, but it's attached here and here, and it doesn't move much. But what it does do is it allows you to pluck it. That was a little hard. Pluck it, which then creates a tone depending on a couple of things. One, I don't know how well you can see this, but one is the thickness of the strings. You should be able to see that there's varying thicknesses. This string here, this one, is much thicker than this one over here. And of course, it makes a lower sound. So the varying thickness of strings, so that pretty much takes us all the way up to the end of prehistory. I hope you had a great time listening to me babble on about prehistoric music. If you did enjoy this video, please like it and subscribe if you'd like to see more. Otherwise, I will see you next week.